Hello, and welcome to another episode of It's a History podcast. I am your host, Madison, and this week we are joined by author Gigi Berardi to discuss her most recent historical fiction, Bianca's Cure. Based on what you'll hear us describe as skeletons of stories in this episode, Bianca's Cure fictionalizes a search for a cure for malaria in the country where the disease was named, depicting the main character's struggles against prevailing medical beliefs. It draws from the author's real and meticulous research, her work spanning science, and her personal experience living and teaching in Florence. I am in the tail end of a head cold, so forgive me if I sound a bit more nasally than usual, and with that, let's get right into it. Welcome to another episode of It's a History podcast. I am joined today by author Gigi Berardi to talk about her most recent release, Bianca's Cure.
I am currently a professor at College of the Environment, Western Washington University in Bellingham, Washington. I am speaking today from a very small island in the San Juan archipelago, Shaw Island. Shaw Island is where we have woods, and I have a cabin my son built for me in the woods from the property and milled it himself, and that's very, very sweet. So, but I work full time at the university. I have taught in a number of universities and colleges, 12 to be exact, on the East Coast and West Coast, but I'm very happy to be at Western now. I am historically or traditionally, typically a nonfiction writer, creative nonfiction writer. I teach writing proficiency classes. I am very interested in history and building histories and imagining histories from the factual skeleton that we have. And that's how I wrote Bianca's Cure. I am very familiar with Florence. I speak Italian. There's actually an Italian translation I worked on of the book that's going to be coming out with the Book Whisperer, which is an Italian group in Florence. I'm interested in unseen men and unseen women's histories in particular. So when I wrote Bianca's Cure, I wrote it originally under the title The Alchemy of Desire. And it was written from Francesco's perspective, her lover, her husband. And it was so dry. It read, as some people said, like a Wikipedia article. And so I threw out all 100,000 words and rewrote the book with a voice-driven approach from the perspective of Bianca. And I think the book now, Bianca's Cure, is a story of both Bianca and Francesco. We know even more about Francesco through knowing Bianca.
I did enjoy reading the book from Bianca's perspective, although I'm curious to see how it would have been from Francesco's perspective now that you said that's how you wrote it. But I do think that having it through was important and also added more to the story.
Her motivation was very serious. She was driven, as Francesco was driven with his alchemy. We know that about both from rooms in the Palazzo Vecchio that each of them had to do their alchemy.
I think we should talk about the premise of Bianca's Cure and the story itself, and then we can get into the separation between what's fact and what's fiction, and how even in the fiction there's still truth to the story.
Sure. So the premise of the book is that people are dying of malaria, ordinary people, royal people, and there is no cure for this disease. God's will is the therapy. And a woman in Venice who comes from a family of alchemists decides that she needs to turn her alchemy into a science. This science is going to give her answers in terms of the cure for malaria using the herb Artemisia. She is driven to go to Florence, where the Medici are, and the Medici are huge alchemists and astrologers. And there she thinks she's going to meet the Medici and get access to their science and make it hers. The book is about how she does that and what happens. Although there's
Yes.
questions, as many questions as answers. Yes.
The ending was quite thrilling as I was going through. I was like, oh my goodness. So, you spoke about malaria being very prevalent in Florence. Do you want to go a little bit more into about the effect that malaria had on this city during this time period?
For sure. I think what's important is to take a quick look at the geography of Italy. Italy is basically 80% mountainous, hilly and mountainous, with valleys, coastal plains, and river plains, especially in the northern part of Italy in the Po Valley. There's a lot of low-lying areas, marshy areas where the mosquito vector thrives. This is true not just in Italy, but we think typically of parts of Africa, parts of countries in sub-Saharan Africa. But the word malaria is actually an Italian word, malaria, which means bad air, and it's a moniker given in the 19th century, really. It is a disease that manifests itself in strange ways. It seems to subside and then it comes back. At this time, it was not called malaria, it was more commonly called the tertiary fever or the quaternary fever because the fever would manifest itself after 3 days or after 4 days, it would subside. And this fits with the life cycle of the disease organisms in the body. It manifested as fever, and I'm fairly graphic in the book as to what it looks like for people. One important thing to remember in terms of the inciting incident for Bianca, it was losing her mother in that first chapter so early on, her mother, who she was trying to save with her mother's own herbal remedies, Artemisia remedies, and then some problems she has in that first convent that she goes to when she's in Florence. As the book evolves, so does the relationship between Francesco and Bianca. And he's not just a means to an end. She cares deeply about this person. At one point in the book, I say, at what point did this happen where instead of saving all people, she was saving this one man in front of her? I think that's her drive. She also knew that Medici wives did not fare very well once they lost their Medici husband. Even with their Medici husbands alive, it was not clear what would happen to her if Francesco were to die.
You've mentioned the Artemisia a couple of times. I think we should go into what that actually is and about the recent awards given regarding Artemisia.
Yeah, Artemisia is interesting. It's in the Daisy family, the Astor family, and it looks very weedy. I mean, some might call it wispy and fragile looking, but it grows like a weed. It wants to grow tall and as opposed to out. And that also might have to do with its quest for resources and a kind of alchemic sense. We know Artemisia in many different forms. And so there's Artemisia absinthe, from which we get absinthe. There's a number of species which are considered wormwoods and mugwort, and each of them have their own healing properties or characteristics. But Artemisia annua is the Artemisia species used for curing malaria. And it is an herb that's been used for its medicinal value for millennia in China. And it was not an accident that Bianca was in Venice and her aunties were in Venice and her family was in Venice, the great port city where one could imagine that cultivars of Artemisia somehow made their way into that were Artemisia annua in particular into Venice. and elsewhere in Italy. So it's the Artemisia annua, and the extract we know now, the isolate is artemisinin, which is used in malarial prophylactics and treatments. It was a woman who became the first Chinese person in the category of physiology or medicine to win the Nobel Prize from mainland China. Yu Yu, and I'm in contact with her lab. Yu Yu won this prize in 2015 for her lifelong work in categorizing and isolating components of Artemisia.
It's awesome. It's so exciting to see, this work, like people's lifelong work being recognized from something that has been used for hundreds of years as a remedy for disease. This
In
is a
her,
good segue to go
yeah,
into women in science and the hurdles that women in past generations have had in earning respect within science, bringing us to.
yeah, I think that women in science has always been a story of gender structures and operating within those gender structures. I will expand it beyond female and male self-identifying characteristics to being historically unseen and uh, not causing feeling that one needs to be nice, basically, and kind of raises questions about niceness and genuineness, drive and motivation. How much of yourself, male or female, do you reveal when you're trying to get a scholarship and you're trying or get into a lab or research group and your work just doesn't speak for itself? In the book, Bianca's Cure, she is looking for resources basically. And I think a lot of science through time is looking for those resources, whether it's a place to do your science, a laboratory, it's the money needed for resources to conduct your experiments. But also, as I get to at the very end of Bianca's Cure, it is a question of presenting your results too and being heard as you are presenting your work. I think it's a long and repetitive story. And I think that's why I have reviews from women scientists for the book saying, in the book, the Italian scientists as well as USA scientists saying that this is my story too. This is the story of women that are trying to, I don't know, get ahead, make a name for themselves, create and have their work credited.
In the book, you go into how Bianca feels that if she had been a man with similar ways that she was going through making the different experiments, how much farther she could have been or how much more respect she would have had in regards to her experiments, working, not working, or even having the ability to experiment with them, because that was a big hurdle she had in the story, was just even finding ways to use her mixtures to help cure people.
Right. That is a really interesting question. And as you were talking, I thought, I guess an argument could be made that had she stayed in Venice, had she married had she married the person that her father wanted her to marry, had she taken over the household in the way that her father wanted her to take over the household, I guess an argument could be made is she might have found resources there. She might have been able to do some of her work there, but she wouldn't have had the respect and she wouldn't have had a community of like-minded individuals with which to share her work. And Francesco, at least for her, held out the possibility of being part of that community of alchemists that were driven to spend a large portion of their day in a laboratory. His laboratory was the casino. She was a woman doing a male kind of science. I'm not sure how many men were asking the questions that she was asking. The alchemy at that time was an industrially oriented, manufacturing oriented alchemy. It was about dyes, pigments, and solvents for chemical processes. And she wasn't interested in that. Even in the convent, she was fascinated by the silkworms. The nuns were cultivating on their mulberry bushes the silkworms who were spinning their cocoons, and then they were processing the cocoons from which they could weave from the silk. So she really was pretty motivated with curing malaria. And I think Francesco, in the end, really was a great support to
Yes.
her.
Even in the beginning, when he didn't quite understand exactly where she was going with what she wanted to do, over time, he did really seem to respect her and what she wanted to do, especially when her wants of wanting to, work with the science kind of over preceded her like expectations of being a mother or a more traditionally womanly figure, especially with her own children and stepchildren.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the Mama Bianca, some of the children call her. In the picnic scene, Virginia's already married,
Mm-hmm.
but her stepchildren, Mama Bianca, she was by all accounts called Mama Bianca. They were looking up to her as a mother figure. And it is important to note that Francesco had this tradition, this history, a family history of being a children-oriented person. His own parents, Cosimo and Isabella, made it a priority to interact with the children, to have meals with the children, which was almost unheard of at that time. So Bianca had a hard time because the standard was a very high standard, especially in the Renaissance, that this man would not only admit mistakes and defer to her, but was a very loving father.
It was nice to see that he did end up taking into account her wants. She was able to do the things she wanted to do, or more felt that she needed to do to try to find a cure. Yes, and she works in the book. You have her working for a long time, working on her notes, going back to her mother's notes, trying to see what worked and what didn't work. I want to try to go into where at the end in the author's notes you have what areas are more factual and which areas are areas that you had taken some liberties. I don't know if we want to talk about that a little bit, where the true facts are and where the parts of the book are more filled in but still based in some sort of historical.
Right. There has been a lot written about the Medici, not so much about the Medici women, but I think of Maggie O'Farrell's book, Portrait of a Marriage. And that book is about Lucrezia, who was one of Francesco's sisters, fictionalized as to what happened to her, again, with a very small skeleton. What's interesting is I do wish we had one more sentence in the author's note. And I tried to get it in, but we'd already done the first print run. That is that Bianca indeed had a studio. She had a studio similar to Francesco's that he had given her, that had been his mother's in Palazzo V. So that studio is, so I'm going to start with that because that's
Okay.
pretty key. That studio is on the secret room tours. And so they all had secret rooms, secret studies for astrology and geology and collections. In fact, her studio is often referred to as a collection room, but so is Francesco's. So he has the studiolo, and it is a room in Palazzo Vecchio, which is a real room with many panels and secret drawers and secret cabinets. His father, Cosimo, had a secret room above his, And then there was Eleonora, and Francesco, as I mentioned, gave Bianca Eleonora's studiolo. So we know that she was doing some kind of study there. We know that Francesco was deeply interested in alchemy. And what has been written is that that was part of the attraction of Francesco to Bianca, and certainly vice versa. So we know that. In terms of dates and places, those are historically accurate. A good colleague wrote a book several years ago, Il Ducato Innamorato, A Duke in Love. So I have the Italian version and the English version, and it is the nonfiction story of Bianca and Francesco during this time period. Stefano is a very good colleague. In fact, he now teaches the latter part of my program in Florence each year. I've taught for a long, long time. And he and I are often on Bianca and Francesco adventures. And we're asking the same questions about what is real, what actually happened, what do we know? We know also that Bianca came from this family from a milieu of women alchemists. And in fact, this is not in the author's note, but just on Friday in my
Mhm.
news feed appeared a story about an exhibit, which is part of the cultural program of the Olympics, opened on Friday in Milan. And it is the women alchemist. It is hidden, it's lost women alchemist. And it's this artist's imagination using the skeleton of stories, but several of the women are women that I allude to in the book. The casino was real. The Hall of the 500 is real. Were the frescoes finished? I don't know. I've had so many historians take a look at my work and ask, could this painting have been there? Did we know that Bronzino did this? Did we? So I've tried to make kind of airtight in that sense. There's a few time periods which we had to either expand or condense for the plot, but not many. In fact, I had so many spreadsheets that had, basically time and place structures. Even the progression of the cure, I kind of monitored just by itself. Could this have happened? Could it have taken this long? That kind of thing. So I used those as frameworks and touchstones. Was it malaria? Was it Artemisia? We don't know. We just know that she came from a strong family of herb-loving women in Venice, which was a very international port.
I think historical fiction has a very important place within literature because it is based amongst, as you've said, like skeletons of stories. And I think it leads to interest in the actual stories of these people and even looking into the history of the area or the broader history in general. I think it's a more approachable way for some people to get into history because sometimes reading nonfiction books can be a little dry and hard to get into. But if you start with something like a historical fiction, it's something that can, I don't know, deepen your interest into something and make you more open to wanting to read something more factual, more point for point of what's happening.
Absolutely. And, those who forget history are condemned to repeat it. History is everything.
Mhm.
So that appreciation for history and saying it with history, all of that is critical. I think the other thing, because it helps us in our understanding of human problems and human nature. As part of that, I think also with everything you just said, and I try and do this in Bianca's Cure, it leaves us asking
Yes.
more questions about life. And so that's why we can appreciate historical fiction. I actually recommend people write historical fiction as an exercise for themselves from a mood-driven or voice-driven perspective. Bianca finds out that Francesco has malaria and she's so far away in Florence. We know that he did. We know that she was in Florence and then wasn't. She was somewhere else. How did she get there?
Yeah.
What was she feeling? Did she get angry? If you use exercises like this, I have to give a shout out to Susan Sutcliffe Brown, who I worked with on the book when I was rewriting it from the standpoint of Bianca. Then you have your list of emotions, fear, anger, jealousy, longing, and you can write and rewrite paragraphs from different moods until you find one that really makes sense with what she might have been feeling and doing at the time. And so I think that helps us understand motivations, understand motives for history, because really the way in which history is rewritten is pretty straightforward, so-called fact-driven. If you understand these people or understand the draw of a place as a character in history, then, for example, when you are going through exhibits at the Met in New York, or you find yourself at the Getty Museum in Los Angeles, and you see porcelain that was touched by Francesco de' Medici. He was driven to produce a paste porcelain outside of China, an Italian porcelain, a Medici porcelain. And as you look at the porcelain, which was part of an alchemical process, his casino in his laboratories that he struggled with for so many years, but then succeeded in producing. And you see a picture of a woman, a design of a woman on this porcelain at the Getty, and you look at it, and it couldn't possibly be Johanna from Habsburg. It has to be Bianca Capello. What does that tell you in the middle of Manhattan? That Florence is not relevant. Florence is utterly relevant. And this relationship is utterly relevant. And how a woman who had been unseen could possibly work and exist with someone who was deeply in love with her. Her face is on the porcelain, and who deeply defended her as well.
Yeah, what you just said just really makes a point of how sometimes we can forget how human history is. Human history, it's where we've been. And the people of the past have had feelings. They live life just like how you and me live life. We experience things in all different ways.
Right.
And you don't often get that just reading it off a page. And having something like Bianca's Curse, where you can have emotions and feeling that goes into how things are happening in the world around you, can kind of make that our history more human, more personable.
That is so beautifully said. Yes. And give you agency too.
Yes.
And no matter how big or how small your world is, you have to find it.
I think that's a really nice place for us to end on the story of Bianca's Curse. While we wrap up, is there anything else that you want to add? Anything you want to say?
I think it's quite beautiful what you were saying about history. And I would just invite people to read Bianca's Cure, but also going to my website, gigiberardi.com. People can download the first two chapters and get Artemisia recipes. In doing that, it gives us a different look at Florence, a place that today in 2026 is full of eager and curious tourists, are part of a mass tourism, in part because it may be less expensive. So I applaud that. Get to Florence any way you can, really. However, there are ways to explore meaning and mystery in Florence without being part of a tour. Using these piazzas, these are real places, as we were talking about before, she traveled in. The garden that she built, in which she built her laboratory and her gardens of Artemisia, was a real garden. It was a place where a real Michelangelo was discovered. As Francesco had said, He didn't have much to do with the Medici, didn't want much to do with the Medici, even though they dragged his dead body back there to be buried. He would not have been in favor of that. But the Medici still considered him and some of his artifacts. That's not going to be on a tour. Just going to Piazza San Marco, you are already in such a mystical place in the monastery where Savonarola unseated the Medici basically in the late 1400s and established, a republic. You can see Bianca's house. You can see the garden. You can imagine the garden. And I would say enjoy Florence and similar places around the world, not necessarily in Europe, where we just have a potted history of what's gone on there, even when they are as famous as Florence for being the so-called birthplace of the Renaissance. And explore for yourselves.
I think that is some amazing. I will be sure to link Bianca's Cure in the description below, and I will link to your website as well. Is there anywhere else people can find you?
I think if they just Google Bianca's Cure, you're going to get to any number of platforms, but it's in my blog that it's in the blog. I follow me, Gigi Berardi, author. I take up these questions of, well, is Artemisia a thing? Is malaria a thing? Were the women of alchemy for real? I've already posted just in the last couple of days about the mystery of Bianca and also these women alchemists. And I love to get feedback and questions. I think there's so many more questions to be addressed and answered. People ask about a sequel, maybe. But I'm also very excited about the questions that are left unanswered in the book and giving a little bit of guidance onto how to think about them.
Well, thank you for coming on this show. I'm so glad to have had you on.
Madison, thank you so much. It was a great interview. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you again to Gigi for coming on the show and bringing us all the story of Bianca's Cure. Links to the book and Gigi's website are in the description below. Thank you for listening to this week's episode. If you liked what you heard, head over to Spotify or Apple Podcasts and leave a review. If you have any questions, comments, or topic ideas, you can email me at itsahistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can also find me over on Instagram and Threads at It's a History Podcast. Thank you again for listening to this week's episode, and I hope to have you in the next one.